she remains tied to community. She remains true to the values and realities of the everyday woman.
All large-scale change is actually just a lot of small-scale change happening.
So to me, feminism is more of a social and political struggle against all forms of patriarchal oppression.
If you constantly find that you are the smartest person in the room, you've completely failed at feminist leadership.
Ignite that sparking others to have a passion for a particular cause.
So feminist leadership, one of the things we need to understand is not just about women playing leadership roles, being women or feminine. It's more of where women lead differently with feminist analysis, values, and ideologies to advance social justice for all.
Welcome to the Lead Like a Feminist podcast. I'm Emily.
And I'm Malene.
Thank you for joining us on our journey to learn from the people using their power to change the status quo.
So as you all know, we've been trying to find our guests by asking you who you know is leading like a feminist. And then we've been making it our responsibility to track them down and try to find out exactly what they're doing that is changing the world around them. So join us and let's change the status quo together.
I wanna be the change. I wanna be the change. Oh, yeah, and I show.
My name's Hannah Wilson. I live in the southern part of Oxfordshire. I was a teacher for nearly 20 years. So I was a teacher in secondary schools, teaching English, drama and media studies, mainly in London. And then I moved up here to be a head teacher. So that's kind of what my career has been. Alongside that, I've been heavily involved in education, what we call the grassroots scene, so kind of like the diversity kind of movement and conversations. So I co-founded Women Ed 7 years ago. Women Ed's a gender equality network for women leaders in education. And then off the back of that, I then co-founded Diverse Ed, and that's how I now spend my time. I'm the director of Diverse Educators, and I spend my time coaching, training, consulting with schools and multiple family trusts, helping them with their DEI strategy.
Wow. That sounds amazing. I can't wait to kind of unpack all of that in more detail. And we've got a bit of a tradition on this podcast that we ask everybody to start by sharing someone or something that inspires them. So perhaps you can share something or someone that's inspired you on your journey.
Well, this might be a bit of a cliche one, but as a student of English literature, so that was always my passion. I've always been a massive reader. And I was brought up in North Devon, a very white part of the world. And I think the book or the writer that really unlocked things for me was Maya Angelou. And I think I read I Know Where the Cage Bird Sings as a year 12 A-level student. I had an amazing English teacher at the time, Sally Mitchell, and she was like a radical feminist. And I think her teaching plus her choice of books, that book really opened me up to a whole different part of literature. And I was supposed to be going to read English Lit at uni, and I actually changed my degree to post-colonial literature. And the second person that also added to that was I'd spent the summer volunteering in Ghana during my A-levels, and I'd fallen in love with a book called Paradise by Abdulrazak Gurna, who actually won the Nobel Literature Prize last year. So I ended up changing my degree to go to Canterbury Christchurch because he was there as a visiting lecturer. So it was those two people really that springboarded me into a different world when it came to world literature, and that really influenced me as an English teacher, thinking about intentional visibility and representation within the curriculum and disrupting some of those biases that we know exist.
It's funny you say Maya Angelou, because I had a similar experience with her actually, where I also loved English literature, read all the Austens and all the, the very traditional English literature. And then one day sort of Maya Angelou happened to me, and it was a similar moment. And I think there's something about her writing that it's so universal, but it's like a doorway to a much broader perspective on the world.
Yeah, it's really human. It's human storytelling, isn't it? And going full circle, that's a lot of the work we do now. It's about whose stories are we listening to, whose lived experiences are we learning from. And I also love her use of realism and imagery in the senses. I think that transportation to another place was very, very powerful.
Yeah. I mean, she is my inspiration, so that's great. So I mean, that leads us on really nicely to talk a bit more about your journey as a leader. And so you've talked a bit about what you're doing, but like, how did you get there? Kind of what led you to really focus on changing the status quo, and like, how are you doing that?
I think about this a lot. I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? How do we become leaders? I have got quite feisty parents. My mum in particular is quite formidable. She was a very young mum and an entrepreneur. She ran her own business. So I think we were brought up in a household where myself and my sister, there weren't barriers put in front of us. It was very much about be resilient, find a way through, crack on, be independent, be autonomous. So I think that was our kind of our family diet. Like grit was very much part of our upbringing. And then I've always been quite self-sufficient, but also quite confident. And I don't know where that confidence came from, but putting myself out there, I guess, like taking opportunities. So I was promoted in my second year of teaching. I was working in schools where there was quite weak leadership, and there was a high staff turnover, and it was kind of like sink or swim. So I very quickly started taking on responsibility, and in my second year of teaching, I was a subject leader, I was a pastoral leader. I picked up responsibility at whole school level for things like communication marketing. So I guess it was the kind of, there was opportunities, but I also had the tenacity and the confidence to put myself out there. So I had lots of different middle leadership experiences. And then I was working in a schools group in South London where it was quite masculine. There was quite a kind of a patriarchal kind of infrastructure and quite a masculine leadership style. And I kept butting my head against the ceiling and not being put onto the senior leadership team. So I did have a moment where I threw my toys out the prams and I was going to leave. Like I knew that my value wasn't being seen, and that they kept recruiting in an image of themselves. And I called them out for it in a kind of a constructive way. And they talked me out of resigning and promoted me to SLT. So I think that was quite a pivotal moment. I must have been sort of like late 20s, early 30s at the time, and just penetrating that quite masculine space and showing that there was a different way to lead. Not only did I get amazing support from my female colleagues who could see that there was a disruption and a challenge there, but the girls in our co-ed school were like, "Miss, like you're an SLT." Like they could see the disruption. But actually, for a number of my male colleagues who also didn't fit the kind of the alpha male role model, they also said, like, you're showing us a different way to be a leader in this space. So that to me was quite a turning point. So then I got involved in things in education. There's these things called teaching schools, which is part of the kind of the training branch, I guess, of the system. So I started being nominated for being part of that. So I was facilitating sessions on the middle and senior leadership program and thinking about leadership quite a lot. And then we bid for some of the Department for Education's equality grants, which is all about leadership of marginalised groups and underrepresented groups. So I ran a massive women leadership programme and also BAME leadership programme, thinking about targeted intervention for those groups who are sometimes marginalised. So I guess that's kind of, it's been sort of semi-deliberate, but also semi-circumstantial based on opportunities that have come to me where I've been.
So I've got a couple of questions on what you've shared. So first, I wanted to pick out that word grit, which you used right at the start, and you said you had grit. And I hear that word a lot, and I just wanted to unpack that. Like, what is grit? How did that help you? How did you get it? And I just wondered if you could. Yeah,
it's an interesting word, isn't it? Like I'm a resilience coach, and I think resilience is probably the UK word, and grit's quite an Americanized word. But there's books around like learning grit, and I just think that character education piece about how we bring young people up. My mum and dad were really young parents, but they brought us up to be really resilient. And I guess some people don't like the kind of the bounce back ability metaphor, bouncing forward. That, like, seeing every opportunity as a learning opportunity and a growth opportunity, and there's no such thing as failure, there's just another opportunity to learn. I think it's Nelson Mandela who says, you don't win and lose, you win and learn. So I think there was just that mentality in our house. And like, there's a couple of pivotal moments where this just shows the kind of the grit we had to have in the Wilson household. When I was 15, 16, I had a really nasty ski accident. And it could have been one of those moments that I'd never skied again because it was petrifying. But my dad got me back up the mountain the next day, even though I was injured, even though I wasn't really feeling it. Because if you don't ski the next day, you won't ever ski again. So that kind of like facing your demons, I guess, was a kind of part of the family upbringing. And then similarly, a year later, I had a really nasty car accident. and my dad made me drive home. And that makes it sound like my dad's like not a very loving person. He is very compassionate, but he's also like, you need to face these things face on, otherwise they will inhibit you. And just the confidence that I could navigate those things, and it was like part of the rite of passage, I guess. So I'm not saying you have to go through horrific ordeals like that, but I guess it's how you choose to react in the moment. It is quite interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I've got a 5-year-old daughter, and I was reading a book about parenting the other day, and it was basically saying that, you know, the defining moments are how you deal with the challenges, not how you deal with the good stuff. Like, that's the easy bit. It's what happens when there's a big fight, when there's conflict, when something goes wrong. It's the response in those moments that is defining. And I guess maybe that's where the grit comes from. It's what you do in the moment of crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talk about that through the resilience coaching. You don't know how resilient you are until your resilience is tested. And once your resilience has been tested once, you know that you've got that inner resource and toolkit to navigate the next thing. So perhaps the next thing's less daunting, even though when you're in the eye of the storm or in that dark moment, it might seem like it's impossible, but you do know deep down you're going to get through it. So I think there's that I know a lot of people who think they're quite resilient, but they've actually had quite cushioned lives. And it's not until you have the challenge that you really know how resilient you truly are.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I wanted to ask about, you talked about how, you know, in the school that you were in, there was a tendency to recruit kind of, you know, like for like, and for people to see, I suppose it's easier, I think, for all of us to see the things that we value about ourselves in others and to think they're the most important thing. And I think it's such a human thing to do. You know, the familiar is often comforting, and we understand our own experiences better than anyone else's. So when we see something that resonates with our experience, there's a natural affinity there, and that kind of affinity creates opportunity for some, but barriers for others. And I wondered, how, based on all the work you've done, how do we tackle that? Because when I do recruitment, I feel like you have to fight it, because you think, you know, somebody comes and you think, oh, they were lovely, you know, we went to a similar school, or they remind me of me 10 years ago, and you feel that kind of, that affinity bloom, and obviously that is effectively disadvantage potentially for somebody else. And so how do we combat that, and what have you learned about how it is
affinity bias, isn't it? You've just named it. I think bias has been a bit of a spotlight in the last few years, and we're talking today on the Memorial Day of George Floyd's murder, and I think the last couple of years there has been a big spotlight on the inequities in society, particularly between marginalised groups. And I kind of entered this work thinking about gender and sex representation, but actually have ended up thinking about marginalisation of other underrepresented groups as well. And quite often schools will contact me and say, can you come and do some unconscious bias training? And I say, I'm not an unconscious bias trainer. And actually research shows that doesn't actually help. All it does is hold up the mirror and say, you've got bias. Well, all human beings have got bias. Like that's a pretty, I don't understand how anyone can argue that we've all got bias. And just by telling someone they've got bias doesn't move it from being unconscious to conscious. It's how we disrupt it. And I think that's the conversation that needs to be had, that when we're all sat around that table, long listing, short listing, interviewing someone, if we are all white, cisgendered, able-bodied, middle-class women, we need to speak to that, and we need to recognise the fact that we've got shared lived experience, and there will be individual and collective bias about how we process things. So how do we deliberately disrupt that? Firstly, it's by thinking about who's in the room and who's not in the room. And if you read like Matthew Syed's Rebel Ideas, or read anything around how to diversify recruitment and make it more inclusive, it's about actually looking at who's involved in the whole process and all the different touch points. So that's something that can be really deliberately done. But then your other point about the affinity bias, it can be quite subtle sometimes, that not only are we looking to recruit an image of ourselves, it's people who have shared values or a shared upbringing. And that's perhaps a little bit harder to wholly identify. And I was aware that I could have become guilty of that as a head of a startup school where we were recruiting around our culture and our ethos and our values. And actually, I didn't want everyone to be like that. How cultural fit thing is quite problematic, that we're recruiting for fit. We're recruiting for someone who's going to come in and conform and be compliant, as opposed to someone who's going to come in and challenge and disrupt. And that's who I am in other spaces. So I had to be mindful that I wasn't then perpetuating some of the issues I was critiquing in my own organisation. So I think it's an interesting one to constantly revisit. And for me, it's about the introspection of challenging self, but having that shared understanding and that kind of agreed commitment that we challenge each other when we say or do something which could potentially be biased.
Great. And I wanted to ask you particularly about I suppose, the value of being part of a community or a network kind of on a leadership journey. Because I know a big part of your work has been building these kind of networks, and we've talked about, just now, how important it is. Who's in the room is probably more important than all the work that I can do on myself, is actually having somebody in the room who's going to challenge me, somebody in the room who has a different experience. And I wanted to kind of explore in more detail what's the role of community and network building in achieving that, in creating that disruption.
It's so important. And there's research that shows that women are less likely to network than men, particularly women who have got caring or parental responsibilities, because a lot of networking happens out hours, evenings, weekends, and it's not always feasible to do it around children. And men will invest in it and they will make that time, whereas women have other priorities quite a lot of the time. So there's quite a lot of data out there about that. And that's one of the reasons why I've become involved in the grassroots scene. So I was an assistant head teacher, about to become a deputy head teacher, and I was the only female at my level. And I was actively seeking role models and mentors who were women who were deputy heads and heads in their 30s. I haven't got children, but I was looking for someone who did have children, because at that point I thought I would have children. And I was going through databases and contacting schools and using my network, and I couldn't find anybody in my locality in South London at that point in time. I'm talking like 15 years ago. So I joined Twitter as a kind of a hope that I might connect with people that way. And through Twitter, I started having conversations with other women who were having similar pains, I guess, and like seeking a similar level of support. And that's where Women Ed started. It literally was 7 of us who were serving female leaders in education, who were engaging in dialogues around some of the gendered issues around education, female heavy profession with male heavy headship as an example, female heavy attrition rates, because a lot of women in their 30s leave because they're school deniers and flexible working. We've had lots of like concurrent trends. So we literally just put out some tweets to say, we're going to create an event, create a space, not knowing that 250 people were going to come. Wow. And this was 7 years ago. Yeah. Microsoft saw the tweet and offered to host us for free. They gave us space at central office, did the catering, and it kind of snowballed from there. Like, the appetite was significant. So I guess my point is, the network I wanted didn't exist, so I created it. I co-created it. I found those like-minded people. Not everyone likes the phrase of like find your tribe, but I found my tribe. I found the people who were also feisty women, ambitious women who wanted to balance personal and professional lives, wanted to challenge the system, but wanted a support network to do that. And we just created a series of virtual and face-to-face activities for people to come together. And like 7 years on, that legacy's very, very still there. 2 books, global footprint. And off the back of that, it's also modelled or given permission or inspired people to set up similar networks. So in education, we've then got BAME Ed, LGBT Ed, Disability Ed, Diverse Ed. Last night I was interviewing Mixed Ed, because dual heritage, biracial identities are the biggest growing demographic group in the UK. We just don't talk about it when it comes to leadership. So I guess for me, it's absolutely everything. Like, for me, not feeling alone, not feeling isolated, finding support, and not just support from peers, but that support that goes up, sideways and down. I've been really fortunate to have what I call my wise women, like people who are 10 years ahead of me, who have gifted their time and their energy and expertise to support me. I, in turn, have then gifted that on to the next generation. And it becomes that, I don't know, that solidarity, I guess, of sharing that information on and passing the learning forward.
And just before we move on to talk a bit more about leadership, what if you had to kind of identify the key learning of your journey and the biggest challenge, kind of what would they be?
Okay, that's an interesting one. Key learning, it makes me think about a conference I went to years ago where Germaine Greer was speaking, and she was talking about what it is to be a feminine or a feminist leader, and that women shouldn't be seeking to shoehorn themselves into a male-shaped mould. We need to break the mould and create a new mould. So for me, that's really important, that I hate watching women lose themselves in their leadership roles because they think they have to dress, behave, talk in a certain way to conform and to comply, because the leadership model they've been gifted is so patriarchal and so traditional and so masculine. So for me, that's kind of the point one. And I think the bit that goes with that is having the confidence to be your authentic self. I'm pretty much the same person when I'm in a parent meeting, in a staff meeting, writing a blog, or at an event. Like I'm pretty consistent. And again, that comes down to confidence. And I get that I've got privilege being a white, able-bodied cisgender woman. But for me, by me modelling that I embrace my authenticity, warts and all, and I share my vulnerabilities, it also gives permission to other people to do so as well.
And the biggest challenge?
Biggest challenge has probably been the criticism.
Yeah.
So I'm one of the I'm Remarkable facilitators, which is part of the Google DEI initiative, and the data is really interesting around visibility of different groups and how male visibility is more dominant in workplaces than female visibility. And when women do self-advocate and network and become more visible, they get more critique than their male counterparts. And I've definitely felt that being the only female on 2 SLTs, I felt like I got undue critique quite a lot of the time from my male counterparts, and I got criticised about things that I wouldn't have dared criticise them about. And then I've got quite a big digital footprint and getting critique in that space as well. So I guess that goes back to I've had to be resilient, and I've had to be aware that, and I run a lot of training on this. Like, someone gave me some advice years ago that you can either choose to stay under the parapet and be protected, or you can choose to put your head above it, but you are going to get shots fired at you, and you need to be ready for that. And I think that's quite an interesting mentality, that by putting myself out there, I need to be resilient to the fact that not everyone's going to like what I say and do. That's okay. One of my mantras is that I'm here to be respected and not liked. Like, I've got lots of people who like and love me. In a work kind of place, it's more about being respected for doing a good job.
And how do you deal with sort of hate in the online space? I think that is such a challenge for women. And I was speaking to somebody the other day who is thinking about running for political office, and their biggest, I suppose the thing that was holding them back the most was the fear of the online abuse. And actually she'd spoken to MPs, and the male MP said, oh, we get very little. And the female MP said, actually, our office manager spends half their time screening our inbox because it's such a burden on our, mental health and well-being. And I've experienced kind of online abuse in a professional context, and it's very draining. I think it can be very emotionally difficult. And I just wondered, how have you dealt with it? What helps you kind of manage that? Because like you say, you can't kind of, it's, like if they're shots, you can't then just retreat and be like, okay, the battle's over. You've got to. It's
really tricky, because I used to engage and like justify or try to get them to see reason, but a lot of these keyboard warriors and trolls aren't going to see reason. So you're wasting time and energy then being sucked into it. So we used to have a saying at Women Ed, because we got quite a lot of hate when we first came into being, just starve them of the oxygen, like don't fuel it. So we used to have a saying, starve them of the oxygen, because I think sometimes I watch it happen on social media quite a lot of the time, that someone's having a dig, poking a bear, and we let them then pull our strings, and we let them suck us into a conversation that we're not going to win, and you can see it becomes a bit of a game, and some of these things spiral over like a whole day or a whole week, and it's so draining. So I've learned to step away. I've also learned to reinforce boundaries, and I try and share that with people who in my network, about the fact that, like, does it really matter what a random person on Twitter thinks of you? Are you ever going to meet them? So I'm much more resilient and detached, I guess, from people who I don't know. But then I do put in boundaries about who could follow me, who can DM me, do I reply? I try to be really good about like not replying out of hours and stuff like that. So for me, I guess it's being objective, it's being strong enough to ignore, but also something that I learned earlier on as a junior leader. One of my line managers said to me that what is being said or what is being done, there's always another message there. And if you can read through it about what's really being said, so say, for example, someone's criticising me, are they really criticising me, or are they feeling threatened by me? When you sort of like reframe and you invert it and you work out what's really going on, quite often it's because someone's feeling insecure or disempowered or competed against. So I've kind of developed that ability, I think, in my head, that rather than seeing it that this person's critiquing me, actually this says more about them than it does about me, and I can choose to listen, I can choose to respond, or I can choose to ignore, because we don't have to take all critique and all feedback on. So I think there is something about putting that shield up around us.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, and very useful. Thank you for those tips. So I wanted to move on just to talk a bit more about kind of what we can do to create the kind of change that your career has been all about. So I wanted to ask as individuals first, like what, we're all, well, many of us, we're working within institutions, within organisations. What can we do to create the kind of changes that you're pursuing?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's sometimes quite a hard thing to do individually. It needs to be a collective thing. And quite a lot of the work I do, it all goes back to this idea of like the culture of where we work, really, and how inclusive is our workplace. So for me, it's about chipping away at some of those normalised behaviours and ways of interacting that actually aren't very healthy and actually do need to iterate. But that's how we've always allowed people to behave in this space. So going back to being confident, I guess, is that I just consistently challenge and call people in and out for what they say and what they do when it is either offensive to me or offensive to somebody else, or is marginalising someone. And I think we can all be guilty sometimes of privately critiquing someone for saying or doing something, but actually, are we going to affect change unless we actually articulate it? And my default setting is to call it out, which doesn't always go down very well, because not everyone likes to be told in the moment that what they've said is not going down very well. So I've learned how to navigate the kind of the calling it in. I also think it's really important that we model the behaviours we want to see, and we catch ourselves, we challenge ourselves, but we also are open to feedback and open to that challenge, because I don't always get it right. And if I don't get it right, I want to be told I've not got it right, so I can reflect on it and I can consciously do it differently next time. So for me, it's about taking responsibility. I'm just going to add as well about the fact that that's what we can all do individually, but that's much more powerful when you then join voices and it becomes collective. So one of the things I talk about around visibility and self-advocacy in the workplace is that actually, if you've got your core circle of people who you work with and you're all experiencing or thinking about similar things, then you talk about it pre the meeting or pre the event, and you have a bit of a strategy. So there's the strategy that came out of the White House called the Shine Effect, where women were being promoted to office, but then they were finding that in those meetings, they were having their ideas stolen or their voice was being lost and they were being talked over. So they came up with this technique that whenever a woman spoke in the meeting, another woman would say it back and say the name. So it was anchored in the moment that it belonged to that person, as opposed to John on the end of the table without a voice, suddenly having a great idea 10 minutes later that actually belonged to Jenny at the other end of the table. So I think there's things like that subtly that we can do in a strategic way that actually then make things more powerful because there's more than one person doing them.
And then I think the second question I wanted to ask was actually, I suppose, taking that to the next level. So obviously we're all working together, we're all working collectively. What are the kinds of initiatives or changes that institutions or organisations can make, or things that you've been involved in introducing that have been particularly effective, or that or that have really worked in terms of creating this kind of change that you think actually, obviously, nothing, we can't just take things always from one place straight into another, but the kind of things that you've seen work in institutions?
Like for me, it goes down to the culture, but how that culture manifests itself and how that culture is paid attention to. So things like the coaching and the mentoring and the training that's on offer, is it really intentional? Like, is it actually addressing some of the culture issues? Or is it just about performance and technical stuff? I was doing some work with a big national bank on DEI, and they said that like all of the training is about professional development, it's not about personal development. And actually leadership is both, isn't it? Like, you need to be good at your job, you need to be competent, but you also need to have the skills, the interpersonal skills to be able to line manage someone, to be able to have a courageous conversation with somebody. And I don't think we necessarily pay attention sometimes to that bit. And I'm being asked at the moment to do a lot of training around courageous conversations, because everyone talks about this is something we need to do in our schools around DEI, but where's the actual training to develop the behaviours and the skills and the confidence for our middle senior leaders to be able to actually frame a courageous conversation? So for me, it's that intentionality that if we want a behaviour change, how are we actually strategizing that behaviour change? And as a coach, I just think coaching is so empowering. I've really benefited it for myself, that having that coach to A, hold up the mirror, but B, be your listening ear, but to help you process those things. That's helped me become more emotionally regulated, be more intentional, be more confident, make sure our values are aligned. So I think that investment in coaching needs to cascade, not just to the senior leaders, to our aspiring leaders as well. So I think that's all really important. One of the things I've done a lot of, because I've been coached, and coaching has that contracting as part of the relationship, contracting in the teams I've led has also been really, really important. So really establishing as a team how we're going to show up and how we're going to interact. How do we like praise? How do we like feedback? How do we do challenge? How do we navigate difficult conversations or difficult situations? I don't think we pay enough attention to that sometimes, and give the time and the space to establish those kind of agreed ways of working. Because then when something does go wrong, you can go back to, well, this is how we agreed to resolve tension, as opposed to there's a tension and then you're trying to frame it and negotiate it when it's actually quite tense. So I think there's some cultural practices that actually really need to be thought about and need to be framed regularly, but also revisited regularly as well.
And I mean, I've noticed that actually a lot in governance situations, like how important it is to have that shared understanding of what governance and leadership actually is in whatever context you're in. And I think some of it is about the fact that we're often operating in a default leadership mode that might be quite patriarchal, that might have other biases within it. And that's the default mode. And actually, and it's not without, if we don't interrogate that at the start, it's holding us back, because we're all operating in this unspoken set of rules. And I think some of the things you're describing, it's like, actually, let's start by collectively writing those rules rather than taking on the rules that we've inherited somehow, or we've taken on subconsciously from our previous experiences. Let's look at those rules together from the word go.
I absolutely agree with you. I went to this really interesting residential in Geneva back in the autumn term, and there was about 100 of us, and there were breakout sessions, and I went to a session on rule making and rule breaking. And there were 30 of us, all like different educators from all different walks of life. And I guess a lot of educators, you are quite compliant, like you are a rule follower and you want the kids to be rule followers, and you don't always question the fact that actually, like, who's made the rules and who are the rules serving. It was such a fascinating 2 hours, and it got quirkier because we just thought it was a discussion-based workshop, but they introduced choreography, and they basically got us to look at dance and choreography as a rule, and how you can disrupt rule making and rule breaking in a choreographic way. It was just fascinating. I did say to these two facilitators, I wish I got you into my school to do this with my staff and to do this with my students, to really get people to explore what it means, because you're right, we don't often question or interrogate who made this rule, who is this rule serving, and does this rule still work for us? Like, there's quite a lot of interrogation that needs to happen, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I wonder if that is the key, whatever institution you are, whatever organisation you're involved in running, actually, that maybe it's going to be a different process. The final result will look different depending on who you're supporting and what you're doing. But actually, that process of being like, let's not just take the rule book that we've inherited, let's look at that in a very reflective, self-critical way as part of our leadership journey. I think maybe that is a really important takeaway.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's making me think about sort of like how a power dynamic works when it comes to a leadership model, and how hierarchical a lot of schools are. I'm not sure about other institutions, but I've worked in some really hierarchical schools where it is all about position and status, and just because you've got the title doesn't mean that you're an effective leader, or that people are going to follow you. And I think that situational leadership is an interesting thing to think about sometimes, that in education, you get trained to be a manager, you don't necessarily get trained to be a leader. If you do get trained to be a leader, you get trained to be a technical leader, and it's the kind of what you do rather than the how you do it. So for me, like, leadership is about how we show up and how we do it in a conscious way.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's really important. So as we come to the end of our fascinating discussion, I wondered if you could summarize for us, based on all the things we've covered, what does it mean to kind of lead like a feminist to you?
Lead like a feminist, I love that. I think what like one of the things that I've been working on over the last few years is, like, what are the guiding values that have helped me as a leader, and how can I then share that with others? So, like, I am an empowered person, and I like to empower other people, but I want them to empower others as well. So I've got a leadership frame that I use that's called REAL, Resilient, Empowered, Authentic Leaders. So it's about how we develop our resilience as a leader, because when you do step out to disrupt, it's not always the easiest route or the shortest route or the most sociable route. So being resilient to that, I think, is really important. Being empowered to self-advocate, because you're not always going to have people who are going to advocate for you. Be empowered to perhaps make yourself unpopular in the short term, and to not always have people who want to follow your lead because you are disruptive. And also, like, that piece around finding and using your voice, I think, is also empowerment, because quite often you become the voice for the voiceless, and you're saying the things that everyone else is thinking. And then the authentic piece around how do we do leadership in a way that is aligned to our identity and to our values, and there's not dissonance. I think that's why so many leaders have wellbeing issues, because actually they're not aligned to where they're working or how they're expected to work. And I think that intentionality around authenticity is really important. And then the L for leadership for me is around our leadership presence and our leadership visibility, and how we're modeling that there's another way to lead. So that's kind of how I look at it, that, like, breaking it down into those different aspects of our behavior, but also our leadership kind of identity, I guess. It's the how do we show there's a different way of leading.
And I think one thing that I think has come across to me is this idea that it's part of our whole identity. And I think a lot of the people that I've been speaking to, there's been a lot of conflict around that, around actually how, you know, feeling like the leadership identity needs to be kept separate from your true identity in some sense. And I think what you're really talking about with that model is actually it's all integrated. You know, it's all one. Your identity is not, there's no conflict within your identity because you're a leader. And I think that is so hard to achieve, but I think so empowering to be able for it to be your full identity, and not to feel like you're having to keep parts of yourself separate in order to lead in the way that is being required of you.
Yeah, honestly, that absolutely resonates with me. We, like, in a lot of the workshops and sessions I run, we talk about putting on leadership masks and leadership armor, and how we intentionally do things sometimes to protect ourselves, but to also be accepted. And I think giving yourself permission to not do those things, and finding your leadership brand about how you dress and how you act and how you talk, and just to like speak to the fact that I also get that it's hard to always be authentic if you do have an identity where it's not safe to be out, for example. So like, again, like, I've got privilege, I've always been able to be authentic, but we want our workplaces to be inclusive enough, but also be safe enough for people to be able to share their whole selves in that workplace environment as well.
And I think a lot of the things you said, they've really resonated with me. I'm sure they're going to resonate with people listening. For people that are kind of starting their journey, you know, what do you have any last practical tips or advice for them in terms of where to go next after listening to the podcast? You know, what should they do? How do they kind of carry on that journey that they're perhaps just starting and trying to find their authentic selves as leaders?
Yeah, okay. Dream, some of the things that have really helped me, and I always share this with people who I'm supporting, that build that network around you, because you don't know you're going to need it until you need it, and then it's not going to suddenly appear overnight. So be really intentional about the circles you're in, and try and expand those circles, and find those critical friends, people who are doing the role you want to do, or are doing the role up that you want to do next. I think finding those role models around you is really important. So the networking piece, the kind of the community building piece, for me, it's been intentional in who you follow, what you read, what you listen to, and exposing yourself to different ways of thinking, and be inspired and motivated and empowered by other people's stories. So one of the things I've got is the Real podcast. So I've interviewed 20 women from my network, and the questions are quite consistent around what does it mean to be resilient, empowered, authentic, and when have you been challenged and how have you navigated that. So for me, it's like curating your timeline and thinking about what you're absorbing, and I think having a coach then help you unlock some of that and process some of that is also really important as well.
Great, thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom with us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, thanks for having me. I'm sorry about the tickly cough.
I wanna be the change. I wanna be the change. Oh, yeah, when I show, yeah.
We've come to the final post-mortem. Hannah Wilson has really talked about a lot of things that I'm not sure we can unpack all of them. So the first thing is about being objective, and objectivity varies across different things, because at the end of the day, we have so many things to take care of. We have our social life, we have our professional lives, and I think sometimes people talk about work-life balance all the time. And you hear Hannah Wilson talk about being able to build the shield around us, but also ensuring that it does not scare people. It also allows our teams to be comfortable with us. So Emily, as a leader, I believe that at some point you have had to build a shield of, this is that time that it's me and my family time. And you find that is when some people have ideas and they want to call in. So how do you personally stay objective and you ensure that your shield also does not scare others as well?
So I think something I've learned recently is about discipline. And I think people often think of discipline as being about work. So actually, making sure that you work hard and you get what you need to get done. But I think discipline is actually more about balance. It's not just about the work. It's about everything you need to do and be in life to kind of be who you want to be. And discipline is about having the sort of the strength of will and I suppose the confidence in your identity to do those things, and to say, actually, this is my time for work, this is my time for family, this is my time for whatever else is important to me. Because I suppose I've always been very driven, but being driven is not the same as being disciplined. And actually, you can't succeed as somebody who wants to lead social change without both. Like, you have to be driven, you have to be passionate and willing to put everything into it, but you have to be disciplined enough to sustain that over a long period of time. And so for me, I suppose, and I don't always get it right, but I think it's remembering that when you're putting those boundaries in place, or the shield as you describe it, which is quite nice. I quite like that idea. I think it's about recognizing that it's the other side of the same coin of being a social change leader. It's actually part of that, and actually it's as important as getting off the funding applications or speaking to a politician, or it's as important to protect your boundaries and have the discipline to do the things you need to do. And I suppose, how do I do it? I suppose it's always about accountability, isn't it? And I think we're accountable to different people in different spheres of our life. So I think for me, it's creating accountability with my family. So for example, my partner holds me to account for being disciplined and having those boundaries. My daughter holds me to account in a slightly less sensitive way than my partner, as she's only 5. But I think, my dog holds me to account if I forget to walk her because I'm too busy doing something else. I think, we need to create accountability. And if it might not be family, it might be something else that you need to be to be a whole self. It might be that you need to go and do dance, or it might be that you need to spend the weekend camping. But I suppose it's creating accountability so that those things become as important and you're as accountable for them as you are for your social change work. And so I think, and it's not easy, but I think that's the way to do it. And then also accountability to self as well. So creating ways that you hold yourself to account. And so for me, I recently started writing a journal where just at the end of every day, I very quickly think about whether I've and it sounds very like over the top, but I don't mean explain. So I talk about what I've achieved that day, but not in a like work sense, in a, am I achieving what I want to be in a more holistic sense? So have I spent enough time with my daughter? Do I feel like I've supported my team? These kind of questions. So thinking a bit more like, am I getting that balance rather than like a tick box of I suppose more like work-based tasks. And I think that helps me hold myself to account, because if I'm feeling stressed and if I've taken on too much, it very quickly comes out in that process that I haven't actually spent as much time as I wanted to with my family, or there was something really important that I wanted to do with a friend that I haven't done, and it helps me to hold myself to account. So I think that's how I try and do it.
And I think I think that is quite something. I think some of us should borrow a leaf from you as well. And there is this part that Hannah Wilson talks about culture. And I know culture is quite a big topic. And someone was saying, just because you buy bean bags in your office and do whatnot, that does not amount to culture. And she also speaks about people who made the rules. I believe that there are sometimes you have had to revise policies over time. And she speaks about who made the rules and who do the rules apply to. And you find that there is a long chain of some of the things that we have believed in over long periods of time. And you also come in and talk about rewriting the rules in a way that applies to us. So I believe that even at a professional level, you've had to have new teams and they had to rewrite some rules, you know? And I've come to realize that it's not all leaders that are comfortable with their employees rewriting the rules. And I think that is something that I would like you to also tell us about, the rewriting the rules bit, because we have to rewrite the rules about not only even now let me get away from the professional culture of our working environment. And I believe that we also have like cultures that we found our parents living in, we found our countries and our systems, institutional systems and all that. So why do you feel it is important to rewrite these rules?
So it makes me think, actually, I did an interview for a role at iRise. It was an advocacy coordinator for working with young people in the UK. And I remember she said to me at interview, she said, is iRise willing to change everything? Because if you're not willing to change everything, you're not serious about inclusion and diversity. And it really stuck with me, because actually we worked together for a couple of years on this project, and we had to change a lot, because the point was to try and centre and enable young people's leadership. And to do that, we had to rewrite a lot of the rules, big policy changes, creating new ways of creating financial support for young people so that they could have the time to campaign, all these kind of things. And I suppose it stuck with me, because I think if we're serious about creating spaces that are inclusive of people who have previously been excluded, we have to be willing to rewrite the rules. And I actually recently had an experience where I wanted to stand for a leadership position locally outside of work. And as I went through the process, they basically said the rule book. It's basically I needed to have been involved for a few more months to be eligible. And I asked, can I stand anyway? And they said, no, the rules are the rules. There's absolutely, the rules are the rules, and that's that, which is obviously fine. And I have lots of opportunities, that's fine. But I suppose I think if that's what somebody says, then they're not serious about inclusion and diversity. If they tell you the rules are the rules and that's that, that whatever they say about inclusion, diversity and equality it's not valid, because actually if you're genuinely serious about equality, inclusion and diversity, you recognise that you have to be willing to rewrite the rules. And I'm not saying you rewrite it in every case, or but I suppose if you cannot believe that the rules are the rules and be a champion of social change, you've got to know that the rules are part of the problem. And I'm not saying that we're not saying tear up the rule book, although I'm sure some people feel like that would be a good thing. But I think you've got to be willing to quite radically and quite quickly rewrite big chunks of it if you want to be taken seriously by the communities that want change. So I think there are my thoughts on that.
Thank you very much for that. Actually, last but not least, there is this aspect that for us to attain change, Hannah Wilson says that we have to be intentional. So thinking about intent, and of which this is quite a huge topic around the same. And you find that, people say the reason that I started this organization, some leaders end up saying that the reason that I started this organization is because I am intentional. But you find that some of their characteristics limit that intent. Yes, they want to bring about change, but they're not willing to change themselves so that that change can happen. So do you think that being intentional is an important factor? Because you have talked about discipline and drive, and how does that embed into intention? Because sometimes some things are very uncomfortable, and when you're intentional about change, you will have to be uncomfortable in so many situations. So tell us about being intentional that you feel maybe at some point was uncomfortable, but right now with you being able to understand things from different perspectives, being able to include other people to contribute towards the same ideas, you found that, if I am really intentional about change, I have to give other people opportunities to change parts of this rule book, and so that it can be able to meet the main goal or those objectives.
Yeah. And I think the truth is that change, when you try and change things, you're going against the system. So it's a bit like paddling upriver. And so I suppose if you're not intentional, then it isn't going to happen. And I suppose that's a really important thing to recognize. Actually, if we may not succeed anyway, because change is really hard, or certainly we may not succeed in our lifetimes on the changes that we want to pursue. But actually, if we don't know what those changes are, if we're not fully committed to them and how they need to happen, then there's no chance. And so I think intentionality is really important. And I think, like I was saying previously, I think it's I suppose you've got to be willing, in the same way that I'm saying if you're serious about change, you've got to be willing to change the rules. I think you've also got to be willing to change yourself. I think in the pursuit of change, nothing is sacred. And I said that again, and I think I've said that before in iRise when I was working with that colleague I mentioned. Actually, if you're really serious about changing the power that people have, nothing can be sacred, nothing can be too important to change. Because actually, if you don't have power, nothing is more important to you than having some power and having some ability to shape and control your life, your body, your community. And so I think, nothing can be sacred. And if the rules are more important, so I suppose things about yourself are more important, then you're not going to create that change. And I think that's just the reality of the difficulty of creating change.
Thank you very much for that, Emily. And I think I would like to pose a question to our audiences and ask them if they have had experiences with changing rules and how it went for them. We would like to hear some of that, as well as how comfortable do they feel about changing the rule book. And this might apply in different senses. The system has its books, as we say, and what is the system exactly? Some people are like, what is the system exactly? But I think the system is what controls different economies and life in general, because there are things that we found being done. Some of us are never even sure why we do them in the first place. Because I remember I once had an argument with my sibling about why should we even go to school? And he was actually talking about the fact, he has been able to go up to university and graduate. And it's like, I've never used the thing that I studied about, some of the algebra, mathematics, I don't even know where I'm supposed to use them and all that. But at the end of the day, I'm like, that is the same system that has been able to build the great people in life. So I would like to know about if other people think that we should change some rules as well, and why they think those rules should be changed. So thank you very much for that, Emily.
Thanks, Marlene.
I wanna be the change. I wanna be the change. Oh, yeah, when that show, yeah.
If you like what you heard today, remember to subscribe to the Lead Like a Feminist podcast for information on new releases, and please do share with your family, friends and social networks. You can also interact with us directly on social media on LinkedIn, Twitter or Instagram, or get in touch at leadlikeafeminist@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on today's podcast. And finally, we'd like to say a massive thank you to Afrocolor Arts for helping to produce the podcast, and to the amazing Sherry Owasi for letting us use her track Be The Change. Do check out her full album Queendom on Spotify. It's pretty awesome. And also finally to Chelsea Madison for all her help with our social media. More from us next time, and in the meantime, keep on changing the status quo.